Okay. All right, we're picking up with English law, doing our markup annotations. In the 12th century, Richard Fitzneill, an English cleric, wrote, "When William the Conqueror had subdued the whole island and by terrible examples had tamed the minds of the rebels, he decided to place the government of the people on a written basis and subject them to the rules of law." There had been written documents under Anglo-Saxon kings, but not all of them were easily available or centrally based. One of William's innovations was to institute written public documents for most government actions. Okay, so doing this made the government central and important in their lives. Even more important in the development of England's present-day system of laws was the notion of common law that took root during this period. The term common law refers to law that is common to the whole country and all its people, in contrast to types of law applying to only certain classes of persons. It developed as society itself developed, based not on legal statutes, but on customs and usage. So law started to become part of their everyday life. They would expect that law could be enforced. They would expect what the law would be and what the punishments would be. One significant law that came into effect during this period was the law of primogeniture, which gave the firstborn son exclusive right to inherit his father's titles, lands, and estates. It is still the rule in England today. Primogeniture, the firstborn inherits. Therefore, if you were not the firstborn, your parents die, your father dies, the law says that everything gets passed on to the firstborn. Notice it is also the firstborn son. So if you were the firstborn and you were a female and dad died, you were left with nothing. So there's all kinds of problems that go along with this. During the early part of this period, matters of law were still settled by what were called ordeals. People's innocence or guilt was settled by setting them on tasks, and if they were successful at them, they were judged innocent. Disputes between two people were also settled by ordeals, such as personal combat, central to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In 1215, Pope Innocent III declared that the ordeal system was irrational. Without the sanction of the church, secular governments had to find a suitable replacement. Okay, so now the church doesn't agree with this trial by ordeal system. And so they had to come up with something else. Gradually in England, people who were indicted were asked to abide by the judgment of their neighbors. In this way, very important jury system came into being. So slowly but surely what happened with the law is it made more and more sense, and it became more central to their lives. In fact, they would judge each other, the jury system. You would be judged by your neighbors. In 2015, a group of angry barons forced King John to sign an agreement called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. Although the charter originally had mainly to do with the taxes levied by the king, it firmly established that levies must be made with the consent of the barons. In retrospect, the charter has come to seem much more important than merely limiting the king's taxing powers. In it, we can see foreshadowed the right by trial of jury, habeas corpus, or the right not to be illegally detained, and the beginnings of representative government in parliament. So the Magna Carta was one of the first times that the king actually had his powers limited, and he had to actually agree with the people that he was ruling, and the people that he was ruling had to agree with him. First time that they started to break down that 100% power that he had. All right, you're going to do your underlining, and you're going to take your notes on the note sheet. Remember the note sheet? So if you scroll to English law, that's the section we just did. You can pause the video if you want. I'm going to go on to the next section if I can find it. Here it is. Next section is the Crusades. In spite of the treasured memory of the great heroes like King Richard the Lionheart, the history of the Crusades makes dismal reading. The First Crusade was proclaimed in 1905 by Pope Urban II. Other crusades followed in 1191, 1202, 1217, and 1270. Each crusade began in high hope, in a genuine desire to rescue Jerusalem from the Turks, but most ended it squalidly in raiding, looting, and a tangle of power politics. So these crusades were the people that were believing in the Christian concept and the Christian religion and the Christian church coming down from Europe and riding and moving down to the Middle East and attacking the people in the Middle East to try to claim the land for their own religion. Meanwhile, while they were doing that, they were killing off the people that were there that were not Christian. And they returned. There was, 1095, 11, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times they returned with their armies to try to convert people to Christianity and to kill off anyone who stood in their way. Still, in the end, Western Europe gained much from these expeditions to the Near East. Christian Europe was exposed to Arabic culture, especially mathematics and medicine, which you might not hear about that much from an Anglo perspective, but the Arabic culture was actually more advanced in mathematics and medicine. So that information was brought back to the Anglo culture. Commercial and intellectual horizons were greatly broadened, and both knowledge and all manners of refinements in living were brought back from the East. It was the Crusades, too, even though they ended so badly, that encouraged the ideal of true knightly behavior known as chivalry. Okay, so we're switching to a different concept from the Anglos attacking the Middle East to this concept of knights. Today, we use the term chivalrous to describe the conduct of well-mannered and sensitive men towards women, but the medieval idea of chivalry, though it included the relations between the sexes, went far beyond this. It sought, with the aid of the church, to make the knightly warrior as devout and tender-hearted off the battlefield as he was bold and fearless on it. The blood-stained, ferocious history of the Crusades suggests that chivalry was an ideal rather than an actual code of conduct. It was, however, of considerable importance in literature, where it was joined to the companion idea of romance. So this idea of knights being chivalrous and being pure and ideal didn't actually play out in real life, but it did play out in literature, where fantasy is much easier to perpetuate. So you guys are going to go on back to your notes. You've highlighted all through that section. You're going to go to your notes, the Crusades section, and fill in the Crusades section. You can pause the video there if you want. I'm going to go on to the 100 Years' War. It took about 250 years for Normans and Saxons to merge their individual identity into one English nation. So what has happened is all of the tribes attacked the English island, and then the Normans came over from what is now France and took over the English island. And it took a long time, it says 250 years, for all of this to get blended together into one nation. Unfortunately for both England and France, the English monarchy never voluntarily relinquished its hold on the French possessions. As a result, there were numerous costly wars in France, culminating in the series of war now known as the 100 Years' War. Although in the end driven from France, England won many a famous victory in these wars. Okay, so although in the end driven from France, England won many a famous victory in these wars, thanks largely to the terrible longbows of the English infantry. Longbows were bow and arrows, but the longbow, of course, was longer, used by the English term from the time of Edward I onward. These 6-foot bows with yard-long arrows capable of piercing a knight's armor were among the most effective weapons known to Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. In fact, the longbows, together with gunpowder, another new element in a European warfare, eventually did much to end the Middle Ages by making knights and castles less effective in warfare. So it's difficult for us to imagine nowadays, but these knights could ride in with a sword on their horse, and they would be an effective weapon. But of course, longbows, the ability to shoot one of these guys from hundreds of yards away, if they fire hundreds of arrows into the air and be able to kill off the entire army from a distance. Okay, so you're going to go back to your notes. 100 Years' War, okay, talking about the battles between the English and the French. I'm going to go on to the War of Roses. The Wars of the Roses. In 1348, England was struck by the Black Death, the first of a series of plagues that killed more than a third of the population. So imagine this, 1/3 of the population dies. The scarcity of labor caused by the plagues was the death knell of feudalism. Okay, feudalism was that concept where if you lived on somebody's land, you owed them. You owed them taxes, okay? They kind of owned you and you owed them. So you would find a place to live and then you would be stuck there because you owed the person who lived there. But once the Black Death happened, 1/3 of the population was killed off. So 1/3 of the workforce, 1/3 of the farmers were killed off, and people had farms with no workers. And so they started fighting or competing over the workers, which got rid of the concept of feudalism. In 1381, inflamed by repressive laws and burdensome taxes, encouraged by the teachings of the religious reformer John Wycliffe, the peasants rose in bloody revolt. The revolt was put down partially, but economic and social unrest continued. Then, hard on the heels of the 100 Years' War came the so-called Wars of the Roses, a civil war between the House of York, whose, I'm going to do that, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, no, it's not doing it. Okay, there. Okay. Civil war between the House of York, whose emblem was the white rose, and the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose. When in 1485 Henry VII succeeded Richard III and united the feuding families through marriage. This happened actually quite often among royal families. Is one way that they could join their interests and join their land and join their futures is they would marry them together. So you wouldn't have to fight over a boundary or fight over a land because now the land belonged to the entire family. Especially if you had that concept of primogeniture where the man was the one who owns all the property. So once you got married, you had one man in charge of everything. He ended the wars and founded the Tudor line. With Henry's accession, the real Middle Ages vanished. We're going to move on to the War of the Roses, between the white rose and the red rose. Going on to medieval literature, the Romance. The form of literature much favored by the Anglo-Saxon was the Romance. Okay, this is a type of literature. I know we have the concept of romance with Valentine's Day and stuff like that, but this was a type of literature. just like, there's types of music and types of fiction. Medieval romance consisted largely of tales of chivalry to which were added a love interest and all sorts of wonders and marvels, fairies, enchantments, giants, dragons, wizards, and sorceresses. So it was like magical stories with men and women. The medieval concept of romantic love came from France. Indeed, the first English romances, verse and later prose, tales relating the quests knights undertook for their ladies. So knights would do things to prove how much they loved their ladies. Were translations from the French. These romantic tales came from three principal sources: Britain, the story of King Arthur and his knights; France, the story of Charlemagne; and Rome, classical stories such as the conquest of Troy. The famous legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, collected and retold by Sir Thomas Malory in his Morte d'Arthur, chivalry and romance play equal parts. King Arthur's Britain is based on Celtic folklore and has almost no historical basis. So here we are with King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and finding out that it's all fiction. The Round Table is not the usual military and political alliance, but an ideal aristocratic brotherhood. Its knights ride forth to realize themselves through individual feats of arms and acts of courtesy. Their adventures are often novel and unexpected, but they are alike in illustrating the chivalric ideals of honor, courage, courtesy, and service to women. The finest verse romance in English, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is about one of the knights in Arthur's court. Okay, so this is about the romance, English literature, medieval literature, and the romance. The romance is the, fantasy story of knights. Geoffrey Chaucer, the first truly great figure in English literature, was Geoffrey Chaucer. Although ready to traffic in the fashionable romance of the day, he obviously was quite skeptical about it, being as sharply realistic as modern novelists in much of his work. Because Chaucer is so far removed from us, and his manner and language, especially in the original Middle English, seems so quaint, we can easily underestimate his astonishing man. He was not only a great poet and a fine storyteller, but also the first of the poker-faced humorists. In other words, there was humor in his story. He was saying it as if he was serious about it, but it was actually a joke. There's just a twinkle in his eye as he gravely, often ironically, adds one descriptive stroke to another, never failing, if we are alert, to make his points. This man, whether moving as a diplomat from one royal court to another or lounging about in an inn-yard among people, missed nothing, and his greatest work belongs not to romance but to poetic and humorous realism. With Chaucer, the writer is no longer anonymous but emerges in all the variety and subtlety of an impressive individual. So in your notes, you have the Geoffrey Chaucer section. You're writing about him and his humor and writing in Middle English. Folk poetry and the drama. From the common people of early England and Scotland came ballads, songs not written down but recited and sung in innumerable alehouses and at thousands of firesides. This folk poetry flourished in the 14th and 15th century, but it was not until the middle of the 18th century that it was carefully collected and published. So this is the same as what happened with Beowulf. Stories were told, but they weren't written down until later. Through the German poet Herder, who had a passion for folk poetry, these English and Scottish ballads came to influence the whole German Romantic movement and then later the English Romantic poets. But most of them originally belong, as their themes and settings suggest, to the later Middle Ages, to whose unknown wandering minstrels many future generations of poets were enormously indebted. The popular drama reached a tremendous height in the Elizabethan age, but its origins are in the Middle Age. Okay, we read plenty of Shakespeare from the Elizabethan age, but apparently the dramas came back from the Middle Ages. During the frequent holiday times celebrating religious festivals, the trade guilds entertained the crowd with miracle plays, rough dramatizations of biblical stories performed on large wagons or on platforms erected in marketplaces or vineyards. As a rule, the wicked characters in these plays include the devil himself, were played as comic characters, thereby creating a tradition of popular comedy that the Elizabethan dramatists followed. It was all very rough and ready, but in these humble performances there was already stirring the glorious theater of Shakespeare. Toward the end of the Middle Ages in England, during the dark, troubled times of the 15th century, the miracle plays gave place to the morality plays. These plays, although presented in the same way as a miracle play, tended to be elaborate and sophisticated dramatic allegories in which characters representing various virtues and vices confronted one another. The most famous of the morality plays, and one still often performed in many countries, was Everyman. Although this play was not English in origin, a thoroughly English adaptation of it soon became very popular. Even during the present century, this play has been performed in the English theater fairly often. English literature owes a great deal to the Middle Ages. In this period, a great many literary forms had their origin. The High, or the Gothic Middle Ages, is best represented now by their glorious cathedrals, have always haunted the imagination of more poetic English writers with a bright, gaily colored version of cavalcades of knights, squires, minstrels, pages, pilgrims, crusaders, troubadours, monks, scholars, and fine ladies in hilltop castles. We certainly see plenty of that in the literature. But the real secret of the appeal of this period at its best does not lie in its romantic picturesqueness, enchanting though that may be. It comes from the fact that during these years, Western civilization, this is what they're calling the Anglo-Saxon civilization, they're calling that Western civilization. There was plenty more going on, and sometimes that gets forgotten about in English class. There's plenty more going on in the East, in China and Japan and Korea. There was plenty going on in the Middle East, down in the Arab countries. There was plenty going on in Africa and South America. But since a lot of the people writing things and publishing things were Western or Anglo, a lot of times that's what we end up focusing on. So we're going to try to notice the difference and focus on both. It comes from the fact that during these years, Western civilization, restless, inventive, aggressive, troubled, achieved an elaborately organized way of life completely contained within a common religion. And that concept of common religion pervades. Okay, so you've gone on to folk poetry. We have one more category, early English and Scottish ballads. The ballads, remember these are the songs of early England and Scotland, known today as popular traditional or folk ballads, arose in medieval times, mostly in the 15th century, from the traditions of the common people. So these came from the things that people were singing and talking and saying when they got together. Because they were passed on from generation to generation by word of mouth and not set down in writing for several centuries, it's impossible to trace the identity of their original authors or to ascertain which of the many variations was the original version. Few of the English and Scottish folk ballads were printed before the 18th century. It was Reliques of Ancient English Poetry, the collection of ballads published by Bishop Thomas Percy in 1765 that gave impetus to an interest in these old ballads that persist to this day. Since the publication of Percy's collection, others have been inspired to make their own collections. The Scottish poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott, among them, went to the English-Scottish border region to write down from the dictation of the border people who were still singing them the various versions of many of these old songs. The subject matter of the folk ballads stemmed from the everyday life of the common folk. The most popular themes, often tragic ones, were disappointed love, jealousy, revenge, sudden disaster, and deeds of adventure and daring. Many of the usual devices of telling a story are evident in the old ballads. The narrative is simple and direct. A single incident is related in dramatic fashion, with only slight attention paid to characterization and description. Little or no background introduction is given, and the story is developed largely through dialogue. The narrative often hinted at rather than told in detail. Sometimes the reader must guess what happens between stanzas or who is speaking in certain stanzas. So when we analyze the ballads, maybe we'll notice something about the way they're formatted, their structure. Another device commonly used in ballads is the refrain, in which the last line or two of each stanzas are repeated. This thus adding an effective note of emphasis for suspense and contributing to the ballad's melody and rhythmic flow. Sometimes incremental repetition is used. That is the repetition of a previous line or lines, but with a slight variation each time, which advances the story stanza by stanza by stanza. Above all, the ballads are musical in nature. They were meant to be sung, one voice carrying the main part of the stanza, with the rest of the group joining in on the refrain. Since the French word for ballad once meant to dance, it is likely that people also danced to the old ballad rhythms. And then there's some examples of these ballads. But at this point, you finish up your notes, and we're all set.